Of the popular writers of his era, Voltaire is rather different from most of the others, because he preferred to try and reach men's minds by argument rather than their hearts by religious appeal. He was a great disturber of smug, self-satisfied opinion. He knew how utterly fatal were laziness of mind and stagnation of ideas. He wanted to disturb, to annoy, to provoke, and, more even than any of the others, he succeeded in his object. In his long life he wrote an astonishing number of letters, poems, plays, and pamphlets, and he wrote very beautifully. But his fame does not rest on his literary genius. It was his striking personality, his startling opinions, and his daring and original arguments which gained for him his reputation and his extraordinary influence. In fact, the middle of the 18th century in France is known as the Age of Voltaire. Of course, he made many bitter enemies, and to this day his opinions are warmly disputed. His method was often unnecessarily provocative. He was stingingly satirical, he scoffed, he jeered, he ridiculed his opponents, and by the brilliant thrusts of his pointed wit cut them to the quick. Although there is a good deal that is far from admirable in his career, the force of his personality was so great that he could not be ignored, and all he wrote and all he said was eagerly read and listened to by everyone. He loathed shams and superstitions, and he fought most vehemently in his later life against injustice and oppression. In his long life he went through different phases, but taking him as a whole, he stands out as the principal figure of the 18th century in Europe. Voltaire's real name was François-Marie Arouet. He was the youngest of the 5 children of a well-to-do solicitor, and was born in Paris on November 21, 1694. He had to be hurriedly baptized, as no one expected that the puny little infant would live. His mother died when he was 7, and at the age of 10 he was sent off to a large Jesuit college, where, as he afterwards tells us, he learned Latin and nonsense. His quick wits, however, made him absorb an immense quantity of information, and instead of playing with the other boys, he would walk and talk with the masters. One of them said at the time, "That boy wants to weigh the great questions of Europe in his little scales." His father wanted him to be a lawyer, and laughed at the idea of his becoming an author, but although he was made to study law, the boy stood up to the rough old man and refused to give in. He soon got into a very lively but very frivolous society, which he amused by his audacity and wit. Sometimes he would return home very late from his bacchanal, and Father Arouet would lock him out so that he had to walk the streets all night. In fact, the peppery old father and the mad young scapegrace were perpetually quarreling. The boy was irrepressible, and it was useless his father trying to subject him to discipline. Another of his finer characteristics was his undefeated persistence. He never would give in. For instance, when a play of his was a failure, he was disappointed, but took it back and rewrote it. All attempts to silence, suppress, insult, or ignore such a man were bound to fail. There are 2 instances of his being twice badly insulted. A spy named Beauregard, whom he offended, waylaid him in the street and beat him. And again later, the Chevalier de Rohan, an arrogant nobleman, fell out with him, and had him thrashed by his servants. Voltaire took lessons in fencing, and after 3 months challenged Rohan, who accepted the challenge. But on the morning appointed for the duel Voltaire was arrested, and sent a second time to the Bastille. He was kept in confinement for a fortnight, and then, at his own request, packed off to England. In 1729, when he was 35, he obtained a license to return to France, which he had only been able to visit secretly, now and then, during his stay in England. The censor kept his eye on this man, who seemed bent on startling and shocking the authorities, so that Voltaire was often obliged to get his writings privately printed and secretly distributed, and even on some occasions to deny the authorship of the offending works. Things came to a head when his English letters appeared. They were by way of being criticism and praise of England, but at the same time they were a vehement attack on everything established in church and state in France. The printer was thrown into the Bastille. The book was denounced and publicly burnt by the hangman as scandalous, contrary to religion, to morals, and respect for authority. It was in the last 20 years of his life that Voltaire played such a noble part in championing the cause of men who were subjected to gross and cruel persecution. The most famous case is that of Calas. He was a Protestant shopkeeper in Toulouse, a kind and benevolent old man. The monstrous accusation brought against him was that of murdering his son, who, as a matter of fact, committed suicide in a fit of melancholy. The motive of the murder was supposed to be that the son wanted to become a Roman Catholic, and his father, rather than allow it, killed him. Calas was tried and condemned without a shred of evidence against him. He was tortured with hideous cruelty, broken on the wheel, and finally strangled. Voltaire heard of the case. He soon saw that behind it lay the thing he hated most in the world, namely, religious intolerance. He set to work with an energy and perseverance which were quite extraordinary. He left off his usual literary work, he examined evidence, drew up reports, wrote statements and narratives, collected a fund, composed pamphlets, wrote to influential people, and devoted his whole time and thoughts and much money to the cause he had undertaken. He succeeded in getting a new trial, and at last, 3 years after the savage sentence had been passed on Calas, a unanimous verdict of complete innocence was recorded by a council of 40 judges. Nothing in his life gave him more satisfaction than his success in this affair. Voltaire's finest qualities, in fact, came to the front in his character of champion of the persecuted. The cynical satirist was merged into the generous and courageous upholder of justice. The oppressed and needy may get sympathy from others who are in like condition, but it is much more rare for one who is neither poor nor downtrodden to give them not only sympathy, but practical and useful support. He grew more feeble and ill, and died at last on May 30, 1778, at the age of 83. Shortly before his death Voltaire signed a declaration which summed up his belief: "I die worshipping God, loving my friends, and not hating my enemies, but detesting superstition." His body, dressed up as though he were alive, was taken out of Paris in a carriage and buried at Scellières, about 100 miles away. The bishops of the diocese sent an order to forbid the burial, but it was too late. No newspaper was allowed to mention his death or anything about him, and the Academy was forbidden to hold the service which was customary on the death of a member. In the 20th century just the same orders were issued by the Russian government when Tolstoy died. Nothing is feared more by church and state than the influence of a great reformer.